In this lesson, we're going to take a look at a more complex problem that you may run into with your balance sheet and cash flow statement and go through how to diagnose the problem and then fix what's wrong. Now, in the previous video, we looked at a scenario where our balance sheet was off by a constant difference each year. So you see already that just looking at the balance check at the bottom of this model, that our balance sheet is off by a varying amount each year. Now, when it's off by a variable amount like that, you have a more complex problem going on. Usually when it's off by a constant amount, it's something simple like not having a sum formula being correct or simply forgetting about one line item as we saw before. But usually when it's a variable difference, it means that your model is mostly right, but that you're forgetting to add in something on the cash flow statement, or perhaps you're double counting something on the cash flow statement or balance sheet. It's usually one of those. Sometimes it can be even more than that. Sometimes you could have multiple problems, but it's usually one of those. So to start diagnosing this problem, one thing we could do is go through and press F2 and check all these sum formulas. We could do that, but I want to keep this video short and just take you directly to how we're actually going to fix the problem. And I'll tell you right off the bat that the problem here is not any of the sum formulas. It's something else that's going wrong. So when you have a variable difference like this, one thing I like to do is to look at the numerical value of the difference and then compare it to changes on the balance sheet. Now you'll notice here that I said changes on the balance sheet and not the absolute value of the balance sheet items. The reason for that is that when we have a variable change like this, looking at this change and comparing it to the actual items on the balance sheet is not going to be very helpful, because when we have a variable change, it means that the change between items from year to year is not being properly reflected. So what we want to do instead is the following. We want to start in the year that the change or the difference or the problem first occurs. So in this case, it's 2010. We're going to ignore 2008 and 2009 because the balance sheet is properly balanced there. So we want to start in the year where our problem first occurs, and then we want to calculate the change in each of these different line items from year to year. So to do that, we're going to go over here. I'm going to take the 2010 number for cash and subtract the 2009 number. The sign here doesn't really matter. We could subtract 2010 from 2009 or do it the other way around. So the sign doesn't really matter. Just make sure to keep it consistent when you have these formulas. We're not going to pay too much attention to the signs here. It's more the absolute value rather than the negative or positive difference that we care about with this type of exercise. So we have that. I'm just going to copy it over here for these 5 columns for 5 years. And now I'm just going to take this formula and copy it down for the other items on our balance sheet. Okay, so now what this is telling us is that it's letting us see the change in each year. So we know that in this case, our short-term securities actually stays the same each year because the change here is always 0. Whereas an item like accounts receivable or inventory is going up by a certain amount each year. So moving to the bottom now, the way that we generally want to approach this is we want to start in the year where the difference first occurred. So in this case, it would be 2010, and we want to look at this number, 114, and compare it to all the changes on our exercise over here and see which item is actually off. So it looks like everything under shareholders' equity is fine. Everything on liabilities is fine. Long-term assets is also fine because we don't see a 114 here. And then finally, when we get up to current assets, what jumps out at us is this inventory, because we see a 114 difference from 2009 through 2010 here. So that definitely jumps out. Now the rest of the numbers here, 97, 73, 66, 56, you have to be careful here, because if you go down to our balance sheet differences, it doesn't look like they appear here, but actually they do. And the reason this happens is because when we have a balance check like this, if our balance sheet is off in one year, then every year after that, every future year for which our difference is incorrect or for which our balance sheet is not balanced, the error is going to be cumulative. So if we're off by 10 in one year, and we're off by 10 in the next year, and off by 10 in the year after that, at first the balance sheet difference is going to be 10, then it will be 20, then it will be 30. So you have to look at the cumulative difference. Now, I like to do this just to verify that this is what the problem actually is, especially in cases where, for example, we have balance sheets with items that are very close to each other numerically. So let's just look at the cumulative difference now for inventory. Go over to P72 and just anchor the O72 part right there. So if we copy this formula across, what we're doing is just summing up the cumulative difference in each year. So we have 210, 284, 350, and 406. And sure enough, that matches the 210, 284, 350, 406 here at the bottom. So it's a good bet that inventory is the only item here that's actually off. So let's go and actually look at inventory right now and first see how it's being projected. So in this case, we are simply taking our inventory as a percent of COGS and we're multiplying by COGS each year. So it seems likely that this formula is fine because nothing is flowing into here from the cash flow statement. So now let's just check the cash flow statement and see if we can get a change in inventory on there. So here in the cash flow statement, we have a change in inventory for the first 3 years, but if we look at this, it looks like for the 5 years after that, this is zeroed out. So in this case, our fix is actually very straightforward. All we're going to do is take this formula for 2009 and just copy it across like that. And now we see that our balance sheet balances correctly because it's 0 in each year from 2010 through 2014. So now this is balanced correctly and our exercise is complete. So that is an example of how you go through your balance sheet when you have a variable problem like that, a balance sheet that does not balance each year by a different amount each year, how you go through, diagnose it, and then fix the problem. Now, the method that we went through here, looking at the changes on each of the balance sheet items from year to year, that does not always work. Sometimes if you have something more complicated, if you have multiple problems, for example, then this method does not always work 100%, but it should definitely be your starting point because it's much faster and much easier to visually scan these numbers versus you trying to go in and audit every single formula. So this is by far the fastest way to fix problems like this on your balance sheet. So coming up next, we're going to be looking at another problem similar to this. This one is going to be a little more subtle because it's not going to be something that's obviously wrong, like a formula that's 0 in every single year, but we'll be getting into that and then we'll be looking at an even more advanced problem on our balance sheet after that, and we'll see how we can fix that by using a strategy similar to what we saw here.